I cooked 15 steaks over the past few days and have the smell of beef permeated throughout my apartment, so we could answer these topics and questions regarding steak. And a thank you to ButcherBox for sponsoring today's video and also supplying me all the steaks. They made this video a lot easier to make. More on that in a bit. The scope of this video is to give you a fundamental food science-based understanding of cooking steak at home. And really the three most important variables are just choosing your steak, salting your steak, and applying heat to your steak. Now, I didn't cover things like cast iron versus carbon steel pans or reverse sear versus sous vide, because in order to make and understand those videos, which I do plan on making at some point, we first need to start with the fundamentals. Lastly, all the sources I used to gather the information for this video are all listed down below, and they're also mentioned several times throughout the video itself. Sources like On Food and Cooking, The Food Lab, The Science of Great Barbecue and Grilling, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat, The Professional Chef, all listed down below if you do want to read them for yourself and check them out. But with that, let's hop into the video and start at the top with, how do I choose a good steak?
When choosing a steak, the two main variables that have a large influence on how we enjoy that steak is number one, the fat content, and number two, the tenderness of the muscle that the steak was cut from. Let's talk about that fat first. According to The Professional Chef, there are 8 grades of beef recognized by the USDA. Now, obviously, if you are in a different country, these won't be the same, but they are great for helping me explain the differences. From highest to lowest quality, they are prime, choice, select, standard, commercial, utility, cutter, and canner. Now, if you're wondering why you may have never heard of 5 of those, it's because these are not used for human consumption, leaving us with prime, choice, and select. What's the difference? Well, it's all about the intramuscular fat, also known as marbling, which is the fat that exists inside the muscle. For example, on a New York strip steak, the exterior fat cap is intermuscular, meaning outside of the muscle, whereas the marbling is inside the muscle. Now, I don't want to hone in on the USDA system because it's different around the world. Instead, just look at the steak. Here's a choice New York strip versus the one from ButcherBox, and you can clearly see which one has more marbling. This marbling has a direct effect on both the texture and taste of the meat. In terms of texture, this fat is solid at room temperature, but when it is cooked, that fat melts away, leading to juicier meat. In terms of taste, you may have heard the phrase, fat is flavor, because it's actually the fat that provides us most of that beefy flavor that we know and love. For example, a super lean piece of steak from the same cut will taste less beefy than the same cut with more marbling and fat throughout. The cut of the steak, though, also makes a big difference in the fat content of the steak, which brings us to, what cut do I choose? When choosing a steak for pan searing, there are 3 that are probably most common: the ribeye, the strip steak, and the tenderloin, also known as the filet mignon. As mentioned in the Food Lab, for all 3, you are really making a choice between beefy flavor and tenderness. Placing beefy flavor on a scale first, generally a ribeye will have the most marbling and fat and thus the beefiest flavor. This will be followed by the slightly leaner New York strip, and then fairly far down on the list will actually be the lean tenderloin or filet mignon. The filet mignon is often the most expensive of the cuts, but it will actually have the least amount of fat and beefy flavor, which may make you ask, why do people covet it so much? Well, it's because of the tenderness. The filet comes from a muscle that is rarely used and is thus supremely tender compared to anything else. The New York strip is also tender, and then that is followed closely by the ribeye. Whichever you do choose is up to you. Test them out next time you go to the grocery store. For me, the New York strip is my go-to as I really prefer the balance of flavor and texture, but I absolutely love a ribeye as well. The filet mignon is actually my least favorite. The texture is incredible, don't get me wrong, but it's generally the most expensive and leaves a bit to be desired from a beefy flavors perspective, so that's why it's really nice to pair with a pan sauce or something like that. So to sum up this section, first ask yourself, do I want a beefy steak with more fat or do I want a really tender one? Choose the cut based on the first answer and then look for that cut with the most intramuscular fat, as this will lead to more flavor and a juicier steak. And if you want to make it easy and ensure you are getting plenty of intramuscular fat in your steaks, check out today's sponsor, ButcherBox. ButcherBox is a high-quality meat delivery service offering proteins like 100% grass-fed and pasture-raised beef, free-range chicken, heritage breed pork products, and wild-caught seafood. They source the meat, you choose a custom-made or curated box, and then it is delivered to your door in an eco-friendly box and always with free shipping. When I started developing this video, I needed a lot of steak, like a lot. Here was the table that I sent to ButcherBox, and thanks to them, I was able to create a custom box with all the cuts that I needed, simple and convenient. Right now, they're running their free Ground Beef for Life promo, where new members get 2 pounds of high-quality ground beef added for free with every order during the lifetime of their subscription. So to take advantage of this limited time sign-up offer, visit my link in the description below, grab some steaks, and now that we have those steaks chosen, let's talk salt. Before we hop into the various methods I tested, let's first go over what does salt actually do to a steak. So first and most importantly, salt amplifies flavor. Secondly, it can affect the texture depending on when it is applied. From salt, fat, acid, heat, it is noted that salt has its own taste, but also enhances the flavor of other ingredients. For our steak, we want it to be salted, but we don't want it to taste salty. So for me, I generally eyeball it and make sure I just have even coverage all over the steak, but if you do want a rule, I like to use 1.5% salt by weight for a dry brine. So for a 280 gram piece of steak, this would be about 4 grams of salt. Now if that's too salty for you or not salty enough, just use more or less depending on what you see fit. Another interesting tidbit about salt is that salt or well-seasoned food activates our saliva. So all else being equal, a well-salted piece of steak will be made juicier not only by the liquid in the steak itself, but also by the saliva that is released in our mouth as we eat it from that savory goodness. Now I think everyone will agree that steak needs to be salted, but let's talk about the more nuanced topic, when should steak be salted? So depending on when salt is added to the steak, it can affect its internal seasoning and its texture. Time is the variable we are looking to test here. So in general, you can salt your steak right before cooking, salt it in advance, or salt it after it's cooked. You see, when salt is applied to a steak, it begins to diffuse into the meat, internally seasoning it, and here's a test to see that. I salted a steak 2 hours before cooking it and then salted one right before cooking it, seared them both, cooked to 130 degrees Fahrenheit internal, then let them rest before cutting off a slice to eat. And here's the plot twist, I cut the exterior off. The one that was salted 2 hours ahead of time tastes seasoned and enhanced still, but the one that was salted right before tastes fairly bland because all the seasoning was on the exterior. It didn't have time to diffuse into the meat. Now let's take texture into account. So salt also initiates osmosis, which draws water out of the steak, and you'll actually be able to see some water droplets on your steak after just 10 or 15 minutes, but don't worry, that water will go back in. With enough time though, the salt dissolved protein strands in the steak that allow it to absorb and retain water as they cook. With these protein strands slightly dissolved, the more water they retain, and the juicier the meat will feel when we actually go to eat it. My question is though, how much juicier? Let's experiment. So these are the figures listed from a table in the Science of Barbecue and Grilling for brining. For a 1-inch steak, the bare minimum you need is about 2 hours, so I wanted to test both sides of that for both texture and flavor. I took 4 New York strip steaks, noted the weight down before salting, then salted one overnight for 18 hours, salted one for 2 hours before cooking, one right before, and then left one completely plain for cooking, which I will salt afterwards once it is sliced. I cooked all the steaks to 130 degrees Fahrenheit and immediately documented their weights after cooking, and here are the percentages for the moisture retention at each stage. So from this data, it looks like we can say that yes, salting in advance will increase moisture retention and thus juiciness. However, I will say the biggest factor for steak texture is what temperature the steak was actually cooked to. For example, even if you brine a steak but then cook it to 150 or 160 Fahrenheit internal, it's not going to be magically as juicy as one that was cooked to 130 or 135 that wasn't brined. More on that in just a bit. The more important benefit, in my opinion, is the even seasoning that we get from salt diffusion, and here are my thoughts and rankings on these various methods after tasting them.
So I have all these steaks and just taste tested all of them. Thought I'd give you my kind of personal ranking on the various salt methods. So first of all of them taste good. Like I would have no problem eating any of them. But to start with this one, this is seasoning after. So I cut it up, mixed in some salt, kind of mixed it with the juices and whatnot. So for me, this one is kind of salt forward. So it's because the salt is all over the exterior, it's kind of, you know, from the juices coating it with the salt, you kind of get a salt like reaction right away, which for me is not exactly what I'm looking for in a steak. I want it to be kind of a more subtle thing. And then the salt kind of disappears right away though as you're biting through it. Like it sticks on your tongue, but then it quickly goes away. And then you kind of just have like the plain meat taste, which for me is not what I like. Then kind of a similar thing happens with just salting right before, you know, throwing salt on, then cooking it. It's definitely more seasoned on the outside because that's where the salt is. But as you kind of chew through it, you kind of realize like, hey, this is like not that great. And especially when I cut off the exterior, it was wildly different. Like it was a bad steak when I cut off the exterior. As far as the brines, I 1000%, it is so worth it if you have the extra hour or two to do a brine. These ones are significantly better than these two in my opinion. Just very well seasoned, and there's not a big difference between 2 hours versus 18 hours. At least I can't really notice anything in there. So give yourself at least an hour or two, if you know, for like an inch steak, I think is perfectly fine. But all of these are very good. I will say the brines, they didn't have a massive effect on juiciness. Like I feel like these are just as good, because really I think the perception of juiciness we get is really more about the temperature, not the brine, assuming that these are both cooked to the correct temperature. So that's kind of my personal ranking. Brine, if I have the time, then I guess I'd do salt right before, and then salting after would be the last one. But ultimately, the big mistake would be using no salt at all, so keep that in mind, and let's watch the rest of the video.
So all that being said, this brings us to our big conclusion on this section. First, make sure you salt your steak at some point. However, if you do have the time, salting in advance at least 1 to 2 hours for a 1-inch steak will internally season the meat through diffusion and slightly increase moisture retention and juiciness through osmosis. Now, salt is a powerful level that affects the taste and texture of the steak, but another lever that also affects both of these massively is how we apply heat to our steak, and this leads us to our next topic: how do I cook a steak? For most, an ideal steak is a juicy interior with a browned and slightly crisp crust, if possible. And when you think of cooking a steak, think of it like this. The method I choose to apply heat is a way to control the temperature and thus the interior and exterior of the steak. As the steak is cooked, energy is transferred to the exterior, which in turn transfers heat to the interior through conduction. So the next question is, why do people like rare and medium rare steak? Well, that all comes down to the meat protein structure and moisture retention at various temperatures. From the USDA, this table shows how much water is in the muscles of meat, and shockingly, to me at least, for beef it's as high as 70% water. And no matter how we cook a steak, at least some of this water will be released, but in general, the lower the temperature, the less will be released. This is why a rare steak at 120 degrees Fahrenheit will have less moisture loss than its well-done counterpart at maybe 160. So I recreated an experiment from the food lab by J. Kenji Lopez Alt. I took 4 New York strip steaks, salted them for 2 hours before, weighed them before cooking, then pan-seared them to 120, 130, 140, and 150 internal. I weighed them and then collected the data. Then I did the same test with a different methodology by slicing up a single unsalted steak into roughly equal pieces, then slowly bringing them to temp at 250 degrees Fahrenheit in the oven. And here's the moisture loss for both of my data sets as well as Kenji's. And obviously, it's not a perfect lab test, but we can clearly see a trend here in the data sets. And as expected, the rare steak had the least amount of moisture loss. This would make you think that rare steak must have the best texture, right? Well, it may be for some, but I would argue that it has worse texture and worse flavor. In my opinion, the more important factor in the texture of steak is the actual meat protein structure, and thanks to this amazing chart from On Food and Cooking, we can see what happens at various temperatures. Take a look at the meat qualities column. So at 120 degrees, the steak is becoming firmer, but it's still fairly slick, which some may like, but I definitely prefer the slightly firmer texture at 130 or 135. Additionally, if you see the connective tissue collagen column, at 130 degrees Fahrenheit, the collagen sheaths begin to weaken, which turns into gelatin. And also, remember that marbling we talked about earlier? That fat will begin to render at 130 degrees, which lubricates the meat, making it taste juicy and more tender, while also delivering fat-soluble flavor compounds, meaning it tastes beefier. For a rare steak at 120 degrees, the fat does not render and actually will feel a bit mushy or slippery, which is why many people do not like rare steak. Also, when you taste it, it is noticeably less beefy in a side-by-side test. Just give this one a try next time you cook some steak. The obvious next question is, how do I cook a steak to a certain rareness? Sous vide, reverse sear, pan searing, broiling, they're all methods to cook steak that I will be covering in a separate video at some point. But at the end of the day, these methods are all about controlling the doneness that you like. For a basic pan-seared steak, I think using a thermometer is the easiest way to do it. From my point of view, if I'm going to spend $10 or $15 on a nice steak at home, I'd rather use the thermometer and know my steak is going to come out exactly how I like it, and you can critically see and taste the differences if you do want to do some testing for yourself. I'll leave links below to the various thermometers that I have and like to use depending on the situation. Now, if you don't like to use a thermometer, you can absolutely do it by feel. You'll just have to develop the knack for what a rare, medium rare, or well done steak feels like for the various cuts, and also keep a better eye on it throughout cooking. Some steaks like the filet mignon are harder to tell because they feel really tender seemingly at every temperature. I typically let my steaks go on their own, and then I'll touch them when I think they are close-ish, and then I'll just verify it with my thermometer. For me, I like to pull my steaks roughly 5 degrees before the preferred target temp due to carryover cooking, though truthfully it is hard to judge. So what is carryover cooking? Well, as soon as you take that steak off the heat, it doesn't just stop cooking. The exterior here is still 170 degrees Fahrenheit, so even though a lot of that heat will start expelling outwards into the room, some of that heat is still going to work inside to the meat, increasing the temperature, and how much depends on the thickness of the steak. A thicker steak holds more energy than a thinner one, and thus will increase the internal temperature more. For this roughly 1-inch strip steak, I observed an increase of about 6 or 7 degrees after pulling it on the pan. Again, we'll cover methods in a separate video, but for now, think about that chart and use a thermometer to nail the texture you want your steak to have at home. With the internal temperature covered, let's talk about what's going on the exterior with why do you want a sear on your steak? The reason we want a good sear or crust on the steak is partly for texture and color, yes, give me those crispy little brown bits all day, but more importantly, it's for flavor. And let me introduce you to Mr. Louis Maillard. The Maillard reaction is the chemical reaction that causes food to brown when sugars and proteins are heated, like roasting meat or getting a brown crust on bread. This browning creates flavor compounds that create complexity and is another reason why the steak tastes beefier. Here's a chart from On Food and Cooking showing some of the flavors from this reaction. It's the same key reaction behind the crust on smash burgers and many of the foods that we know and love. So now that we know we want a good crust, the question is now, how do you get a good crust on a steak? Again, from our friend Kenji, he notes that in order for a steak to brown, these 3 things will need to happen in order. First, the exterior surface temperature of the steak must rise to 212 degrees Fahrenheit. Second, the heat must evaporate the surface moisture. And third, the heat must increase to approximately at least 300 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, where the Maillard reaction or browning actually starts to occur. So you may be thinking, if the steak only needs to hit 212 and then 300, why does everyone say you need a ripping hot pan? Well, the key is you want to spend as little time as possible in those first 2 stages. And here's a simple experiment showing why. I took a ribeye steak and cooked one with a pan temp of 300 degrees using some butter basting, and I just cooked it until the final temp was 130 internal. But as you can see, there's no delicious browning in sight. Then I cooked another steak, this time at roughly 350 degrees Fahrenheit, until I developed a good crust, beautifully brown this time, but when you slice it open, it's as dry as the Sahara Desert. In both cases, the pan wasn't hot enough, and as you can see, you'll either get a properly cooked interior with no browning, or a great browning with a supremely overdone interior, and we want to find the happy medium between those two. Now, it's really the second step that needs to be filled as fast as possible, because the moisture is the #1 thing that will stop a steak from getting nice and brown. This is why I shoot for at least 450 degrees Fahrenheit on the surface of my pan. So in order to make our steak sear as efficiently as possible, here's a little checklist that you can go through. First, start with a dry surface on the steak. Excess moisture takes longer to sear. Second, use a heavy pan. The heavier the pan, the more energy it will retain, which is why many prefer cast iron, though carbon steel or stainless steel work just fine as well. I think I'm going to do a video testing pan types. Third, use a ripping hot pan. Again, I'm shooting for 450 degrees Fahrenheit or higher. If you don't have a surface thermometer though, as Kenji points out, you can use the lead-in frost effect. I'll link the article for you if you want to check it. Or if your pan is smoking, that's typically a good sign. Fourth and finally, use a fat. Using oil in the pan or right on the steak is going to increase the thermal contact between the meat and the pan, meaning more efficient heat transfer. And using these 4 guidelines should help you get to a beautifully brown crust. It's also prudent to note that thicker steaks make it much easier to get a browned exterior and medium rare, medium interior, since it takes longer to cook and more heat to do so. For a thinner cut steak, you're definitely going to have your work cut out for you. Now, there are a lot more areas for exploration, such as butter basting, using mayo, and testing different pans, but here are the basic principles learned from this section on heat. So as soon as you pull that steak off the heat, there are now 3 more things you may want to think about: carryover cooking, resting, and slicing. So we covered carryover cooking earlier, but as a quick reminder, the heat on the exterior of the steak will move inward and continue raising the internal temperature of the steak, depending on the thickness. For the New York strips that I cook, I typically target about 125 internal and then just let it come up to 130 on the plate. Now let's talk about resting. So if you cut into a steak right away, you may notice juices start to expel on your plate compared to one that maybe has rested for 5 or 10 minutes. Why is that? Well, as we talked before, when cooking a steak, we are expelling moisture through tightening of the muscle fibers, but when those are allowed to cool a bit, 2 key things are happening. Number 1, the structure of the muscle fiber loosens, allowing them to hold more moisture. And number 2, the proteins and dissolved fats will start to cool and thicken up. Both of these things result in a steak that, when cut, retains more moisture in its slices, giving us a succulent mouthfeel. So it sounds like you should just rest your steak every time, right? Well, not so fast. Here's the other side of the argument. So I recreated an experiment done in the science of great barbecuing and grilling. I took 2 steaks, cooked to 130 degrees internal, then immediately sliced one of them into strips. Then I let the other rest and then cooled down to 125 before slicing them. As soon as they were cut, I placed the strips in a funnel and collected the juices in a beaker for both. So clearly, the one that wasn't rested at all has a lot more juices lost down in the beaker. However, this is only like 10 milliliters. In practice, both are still absolutely delicious, and I think it depends on the situation if you need to rest it or not. For one, it's not like these juices are just gone. You can always just pour them over your steak, which is exactly what I did, but let me explain a scenario for you. So I typically rest my steak all the time, especially if I pull it off early at 125 and account for the carryover cooking. It should give me the perfect doneness and allow everything to relax. However, if I accidentally overcook my steak and don't pull it off until 135 or 140, if I let this steak to rest, that carryover cooking may bump it up all the way to 150. So I have a decision to make. Do I slice it now to kind of halt that carryover cooking process but have more juices expelled? Or do I let it cook but retain more juices in the steak itself? I'll let you decide at home. But lastly, let's talk about slicing. So you may have heard always slice across the grain for a steak. And this does matter a lot for certain cuts like tri-tip, flank, and skirt steak because these are whole muscle cuts. However, all of the cuts that I talked about today have already been cut from a whole muscle. For example, if you stack these New York strips, the muscle is running long up and down, and thus these steaks have already been cut across the grain. Now, you could technically make a diagonal cut to go against the grain again, but it's really not necessary. And with that, here's the recap on the section of what do you do with your steak after you pull it off the heat.
So I know that was a ton of information in this video, and like I said, everything's timestamped below, including just the little recaps of each section if you want to refer back to them. But I think it's safe to say that we all have our bachelor's degree in steak now. Again, this video was all about the fundamentals of cooking steak. You know, there are already so many other ideas and video topics I have planned, like, you know, what's the best pan for searing a steak? How about different fats, mayo versus oil, or how does the steak change when you use reverse sear versus a sous vide, and what are pros and cons of both? But before we get to those videos, they're really all built on the fundamentals that were discussed in this one. So if you guys have enjoyed, definitely drop me a like and subscribe. Thank you again to ButcherBox for sponsoring today's video. And let me know down in the comments if you do enjoy this type of video. For me, it is a lot more work, but I really do enjoy making these. And I feel like these videos don't really exist that kind of cover holistically the basics of, you know, how do you cook a steak, or maybe how do you make bread, or some of these other topics. So I'd like to do more of these videos in the future, but that's gonna wrap it up for me in this one. I will catch you all in the next one. Go make some steaks. Peace, y'all.